Okay, let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wharton Library. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture in the whole series, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. As usual, because we have a large audience, we'll handle the Q&A at the end as follows. You can send me your questions using the Q&A button, and I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. And of course, as you've heard me mention before, Mark is quite happy to answer questions directly that you can email him later. If you need his email address, just let me know. One thing we're going to do that's a little different this time is after Mark gives us an introductory comment about the novel, I hope many of you have read it. I just finished reading it yesterday. He would like to get some comments from you all of a very general nature, your general impression, your general reaction to this novel after having read it. No specific detailed questions. We can get into that later. Just your general reaction or impression, and then we'll go on from there. So use the Q&A button, send them on to me, and I'll relay them to Mark, and then we'll continue with the lecture. Thanks. Mark.
Thank you, Michael. And just to amplify, this is one of the novels that I most especially miss that we're not in a seminar give and take kind of environment, because it's a book that, although I've read and have talked about in different contexts, I've never taught before to a class, either of adults or college students. And so I don't have my own sense of the feedback from people, certainly not in the 21st century. So I have plenty to say about it, but I'd like to hear from you in a few minutes. So this is the last of the books we're doing in this series that is more than 100 years old. We cross over the anniversary line next time with In Our Time, 1925. Tonight, This Side of Paradise, 1920, the first of the 4 novels that Fitzgerald published in his lifetime. The great American poet T.S. Eliot wrote in The Wasteland, published in 1922, "I had not thought death had undone so many." He's channeling the language of Dante's Inferno, but he's talking about imagining the dead soldiers walking over London Bridge, which he calls an unreal city. The Wasteland, like many literary works, including Ulysses, published in the same year, 1922, is a modernist work suffused with the aftermath of the Great War. And in the years following the Great War, a number of American writers integrated considerations of that conflict and its continuing legacy into their writing, while also responding to the dictum of the poet Ezra Pound, who said, "Make it new." Just those 3 words. Make it new, throw off the old forms. You can think of the 19th century as effectively ending in Europe and America with the First World War. Ernest Hemingway and other modernist writers felt that the war was based on a great lie. The lie was that it's an honor to die for one's country. And many of the critics of the war felt that people weren't even dying for their country, that they were dying because of the outworn treaties between 19th century world powers, such as the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, and that those conflicts led to the death of millions of combatants and civilians. As a result, it was in the literary arts especially that America and Europe saw their writers rejecting old forms and embracing what one critic has called the task, this is a quote, "the task of restoring freshness to a much abused language." When people say incorrectly that Hemingway writes in short sentences, what they should be saying is he writes in sentences of varied length, but they're not rococo, they're not ornate, they're not rhetorically complex. He uses very few coordinated conjunctions. There's very few while or meanwhile at the same time. One thing happens and another thing happens and another thing's happened, because he's trying to write in the flatness to avoid the rhetoric, the kind of rhetoric that invited young men into war. So we saw this freshness in writing last time in Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, and we'll see it next time with Hemingway's remarkable short story collection, In Our Time. And let me say, Michael and I were just discussing, the novel In Our Time is a good 150 pages long. Online, there appears to be a version that he published earlier that is very slight and less than 50 pages long. If you see that version, you're welcome to read it, but it's not the book that's assigned. This is a regular length novel, short length, about 150 pages. So we'll see also this making new tonight when we notice that the most remarkable thing about Fitzgerald's first novel is that it's not at all a conventional novel. Whereas a typical coming of age novel follows a classic chronological path tied to the maturation of its protagonist, This Side of Paradise is an amalgam of various genres and forms, drama, poems, both original and previously published and quoted, letters, numerous subheads within titles, within chapters, below the heading of the chapter that continually remind us that we are reading a work of literature. In this way, we're both invited into the verisimilitude of the early life of Amory Blaine, very closely allied with Fitzgerald's own life, and we're kept at a distance from it. The result is a kind of metafiction, that is a novel that reminds us that it knows it's a novel, reminds us of its status as artifice. That's very modernist. One example of this occurs in Book 2, Chapter 3, which has the title Young Irony. Just a few paragraphs in, as the narrator is describing how Amory recalled his relationship with Eleanor Savage, the narrator abruptly interrupts his own account of Eleanor's family history by stating, "I see I'm starting wrong. Let me begin again." The effect is to undermine, or at least to counterbalance, any emotional connection we might be making with the book. So I'm going to stop there for a moment because I'm curious to know, in as general as you're able to say, what you found about the book as a reading experience, what you thought of it as a novel. I'm always happy to hear whether you liked it or not, but I'm more happy to hear how you experienced the ease or difficulty, the pleasure or displeasure of the actual reading. So I'm going to stop for a moment and ask Michael if he finds any of those comments from you before I go on.
Okay, folks, so go ahead and use the Q&A box to give me some comments, which I'll pass along to Mark, as he said. While I'm letting you, here, we've got one. I found the protagonist's values deeply off-putting. It made it hard for me to care about what happened to him.
Yeah. So let me start with that. This is not, we didn't arrange this previously, but that does not surprise me. I would anticipate that response from at least somebody in a group of, we're up to some 90 people. I don't think that Fitzgerald set out to make it off-putting, but I think he has a very problematic relationship with his own protagonist, which is a kind of dark version of himself done to excess. It's a jazzed up version of himself. This is a jazzy novel. That is, it's a novel that tries to break the pattern of convention. Again, a coming of age novel has a pattern. Now, this is chronological. Each chapter follows from something else, but it focuses excessively on the people, the women that Blaine falls in love with, and it gives very short shrift to his time in the war, which makes it into an interlude chapter between the first book, not even a chapter, and the second book, which is an odd thing when you consider how young he is when the book ends. And one would have thought that his experience in the war would have been formative to wherever he winds up at the end of the novel. What I want to suggest, even just from that one statement, although I'll take more, and I want to thank the person who contributed that, is that it is a novel, I think, that many people find While you might admire the Monsignor and you might admire the style of the writing or the audacity of the conception of the book, it's not satisfying in the way that most people look for in a novel, in my limited experience, which is why I'm going to turn back to Michael to say, do other people, do you see other comments in one direction or another, Michael, about general reactions?
Yeah, well, this is a short one just to get in there, and then there are a couple of others to follow. This person found it enjoyable and also quite intriguing. Someone else says, I have always found an emotional feeling caring about the man and the woman resembling Gatsby and Zelda.
Gatsby, he said she wrote Gatsby and Zelda?
Gatsby and Zelda, yeah.
Yeah, so of course it's Fitzgerald and Zelda, but it's an understandable
Right.
mistake because this novel is based on Zelda and Scott, and yet it's easy to blur that. In The Great Gatsby, the reason I think it's his masterpiece, and the reason we're not doing it is that I've done The Great Gatsby in Connecticut many times, and Michael and I agreed it might be good to put some new Fitzgerald blood by picking a different novel. So I was happy to do this one. But in The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway is the reasonable person who finds the social set that Gatsby moves among distasteful, and the person who enacts or realizes the conspicuous consumption and the urge for success and winning the girl because you're wealthy is Jay Gatsby. In this novel, there's no such split between the person who wants to pursue the American dream and its tawdriness and the person who's criticizing it. The person who serves as a kind of counselor to Amory is the Monsignor, and the Monsignor was himself someone interested in pursuing girls and is very sympathetic and not really critical to Amory. So whether that's a choice that Fitzgerald made or more likely too young in his artistic abilities to make that double focus novel remains to be seen. I'll take another one or two and then I'll go back to my talk, Michael. Thank you.
Okay, so someone put into the chat, seemed disjointed, poetic references were not always attributed, so an assumption that the reader would know them. The chapter where the close friend died in an accident was quickly dropped by the next chapter.
Yeah. So I'll let that be the last comment and say that if anybody wants to share their comments with me after the fact by email, I'm happy to take them. So disjointed is exactly the right word. And a good example that when Dick Humberg is killed, which is very upsetting to Amory, it's very abrupt and it's moved on very quickly. Of course, it resurrects itself in the next chapter when he has the horrific vision of the devil man, the man with not just shoes, but feet that seem to turn the wrong way, like a medieval demon. He imagines he's being chased by that figure. As the chapter goes on, he confronts it in a New York City apartment, and he realizes at the end of that section that the face that that devil had, that he didn't process because he was too much looking at the feet, is Dick Humberg's face. So there's something to be said for maybe the chapter in which the accident actually happens is disposed of very quickly because it's unpleasant. And then the narrator and Amory pay the price of having it come back. This all points to what I want to say in the talk, so I appreciate that contribution. Going back to this idea that in book 2, chapter 3, the novelist or narrator says, I'm going to begin again, and that this is a counterbalance to any way you want to get involved in the book. If you're reminded that this book, which has a lot of verisimilitude, that is, people act like real people, we imagine that they have motivations like you and me, and part of your identification emotionally and aesthetically with a book of realistic fiction is to be realistic. But if the book is constantly reminding you that it's a book, it breaks that compact. And another example is the enactment in that same chapter of Eleanor's demonstration of what she calls her crazy streak in sending her horse and nearly herself over a cliff the near suicide marking the end of Amory's love for her, when we are told in one instance that that love waned slowly with the moon, and then a mere 2 sentences later that it had morphed into, quote, they're hating each other with a bitter sadness. The question is, how are we to react? How are we to react to this wacky near suicide because he has just claimed in his presumptive way that she's going to die peacefully in her bed? She almost kills herself. She kills her horse. She says she's done this before. And are we to find that episode moving or melodramatic or artificial or black comic? That the chapter then ends with a pair of poems that each one had sent to the other, quote, several years later, just complicates the tone even more. Are we supposed to think that those poems, if you actually read them, and I understand that often my undergraduates and some adults skip that, like they skip the pronunciation of Russian names in Russian novels. Are we supposed to think that that's poignant that they've exchanged letters a year later? Is she just an anomaly in his many loves? The tone is disjointed, not just the stories. And we talked about collage, the disconnectedness and reconnectedness being an aspect of modernism. We saw it in Winesburg, Ohio. We will see it even more extremely next time in our time. And in our last novel, The Sound and the Fury, we will see it in the different narrators and different narrative styles of the sections of that book. So that chapter ends with a pair of poems, as I said, and then the next chapter, chapter 4, shifts abruptly to Amory having returned to New York City area and walking along the boardwalk in Atlantic City. The point is that the novel is not just an assortment of styles and genres, but a veritable hodgepodge of tone and sensibility. Again, a kind of jazzy version, breaking expectations, syncopating the rhythm of what we expect in a novel. I would elaborate, if I had more time, on how a self-conscious text that is a novel that reminds us that it's a novel may be seen as a form of conspicuous consumption. And that economics phrase, conspicuous consumption, was coined at the end of the 19th century, but it reached its height in the 1920s. You may remember the scene in Gatsby where Daisy just can't get over how beautiful the many silk shirts that Gatsby has as he tosses them in multicolors from his ample closet or drawers. And she cries out of the beauty of those shirts. Nobody needs that many shirts. The consumption is meant to be conspicuous because it's not the usefulness, but the advertisement of the luxury that is being underscored. It's not an accident that Amory works for a time in advertising. If you believe that language, the way that Hemingway and others did, is capable of foisting a great lie on you, what better place to look than advertising? So in the same vein of this sort of wackiness of self-conscious narration, we expect a coming of age story to end with some kind of resolution, typically an engagement or a marriage or some other marker of personal fulfillment, such as a new worldview or some success, whether an occupation or a career. Instead, Amory is seen on his long walk back to Princeton, sitting down by the Jersey roadside and, quote, looking at the frost-bitten country. In the final 2 pages of the novel, he sees the problem of evil as the problem of sex and sees both as linked to beauty. Quote, the beauty of great art, the beauty of all joy, most of all, the beauty of women. Now, I want to point out that phrase, the beauty of great art, the beauty of all joy, most of all, the beauty of women, has nothing in it about conspicuous consumption, has nothing in it about money. But in Fitzgerald's novels and in this novel and in his own life, money is at the root of everything. When Nick Carraway can't figure out what it is about the quality of his cousin Daisy Buchanan's voice and is struck by how it reminds him of something, but he's not sure what, it's Gatsby who says, "Oh boy, it's the sound of money. Her voice has the sound of money." When Amory comes to this notion that beauty and art, I mean, he wants to be a writer, he is created by a writer, the beauty of all joy, and most of all, the beauty of women, what he's leaving out of the formula as a kind of self-deception is the attractiveness of stuff, of money. So I'll go on to say, we're told in those last 2 pages of the novel that he continues his disillusionment by seeing as so much more important to be a certain kind of man rather than being a certain type of artist. He comes to that conclusion. He doesn't say that's what he aims to do. The language is very clear. He sees it much more important to be a certain kind of man than being a certain type of artist. He walks for a time through a graveyard, and we're told that there's the dull ache of a setting sun when even the clouds seemed bleeding. That's a very odd image. So I want to suggest to you, if you will keep in mind that horrific vision of the devil man with the upturned feet, who seems medieval, who later on is revealed in his memory to have the face of his dead friend killed in an automobile accident. There's an automobile accident in The Great Gatsby. And if you keep in mind here the dull ache of a setting sun when even the clouds seem bleeding, that's a horrific image, a real wasteland image. Amory has an epiphany of a new generation. He calls them the chosen youth from the muddled, unchastened world, still fed romantically on the mistakes and half-forgotten dreams of dead statesmen and poets. Here was a new generation shouting the old cries, learning the old creeds through a reverie of long days and nights, destined finally to go out into that dirty gray turmoil, again, the wasteland, to follow love and pride. A new generation dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success, grown up to find all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths in man shaken. So a generation dedicated more than the last to the fear of poverty and the worship of success. Now, the author of that insight of this new generation, not quite the lost generation of what Gertrude Stein referred to in the same time period, the author of that insight was himself part of that new generation. Fitzgerald was deeply fearful of poverty and wholly captivated by the worship of success. It's not an accident that Amory has to walk back to Princeton because he has so few dollars in his pocket. Indeed, Fitzgerald wrote this novel in the hope that its commercial success, which did in fact follow, would provide him with financial prospects that would convince Zelda Thayer, on whom Rosalind Connage is partly based, to accept the marriage proposal, which he had earlier turned down. And accept him she did. He made his reputation and fortune on this novel. He followed it immediately thereafter with short stories, Tales of the Jazz Age, Flappers and Philosophers, which sold very well. He made more money per investment on his short stories. And to his chagrin, his next 2 novels, including The Great Gatsby, were not equally successful. So it worked so well to win him Zelda that This Side of Paradise was published on the 26th of March, 1920, so the anniversary is coming up. And the couple was married 8 days later in St. Patrick's Cathedral. Yes, St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's all who you know. So when Amory Blaine declares to no one but the sky in the last line of the novel, "I know myself, but that is all," it's an open question as to whether the same could be said of its creator. That is, it's not clear to me, even though I think I know this novel well, how aware of his own relationship to his protagonist Fitzgerald was, but I think he's very aware that he's writing a hodgepodge novel because of the pressures of the time, not the pressures of Princeton, not the pressures of young love. College and young love are old news. But what shatters the pattern of a coming of age novel, what shatters the pattern of a conventional novel, more conventional novel like The House of Mirth, which is why I began this series with that, is the war, is the fact that the war happened. And putting it into the compartment of an interlude and masking it partly by having letters written instead of an enactment of what goes on is a strategy that doesn't diffuse its effect in the novel. So if the pattern of a usual coming of age novel is shattered by Fitzgerald here, we can say the same if we view This Side of Paradise through the lens of a choice of life novel, the kinds of novels we talked about in my Victorian novel series, and as recently as the first of these talks on the modern American novel when we considered The House of Mirth. So before I pause here at the bottom of the hour to take questions or comments, it is a coming of age novel that does not fit the usual pattern of that kind of novel. And it's very much a choice of life, which often translates into a choice of mate novel, that also explodes that pattern in interesting ways that I will talk about on the other side of this interlude when I turn to Michael again. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Mark. So why don't we can pick up a couple of comments from earlier on that you may want to just react to. I'll combine two of them together. So I enjoyed the story. I wanted to know how it would resolve. I found Amory a rather shallow, one-dimensional character, but I found the language beautiful. And the second comment that's kind of related is I found the book dated in its emotional nature, but the latter parts of the book I enjoyed very much.
Yeah. So again, I really appreciate people's being generous in their comments. The idea that he is not someone you cotton to. Could you read the first comment again? I want to do justice to the language. Are you able to do
Yes.
that, Michael? Yeah.
Person said, I enjoyed the story very much and I wanted to know how it would resolve. I found Amory a rather shallow and one-dimensional character, but I found the language beautiful.
Right. So that's great. I applaud that person. I think that's a very insightful comment. Yes, he's shallow and one-dimensional. I think because that's Fitzgerald's aim. I don't think he thinks of him as heroic. I think when the egoist becomes a personage, that's in the title of the last chapter, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And who knows what's meant by, I know myself, but that's all. How many people actually know themselves? But for that person to say in the same comment, found the writing impressive, here's what I want to suggest. And I think this is true from Tales of a Jazz Age and how Fitzgerald writes a table of contents in that remarkable book, just a few years later than this one. He is not interested in promoting Amory, but he is interested in promoting himself. He's a writer on the make, and he has reason to want this book not only to sell well, but to make a name for him. And so in some ways, the metafiction aspects of the book are a way of saying, you may be disappointed in Amory, but you can't be disappointed in me. Look at how interesting this book is. Look at how well I handle a petting party or the odd relationship between the various women that Amory comes in touch with. There isn't a sustained narrative line through the book. It's very episodic. Again, that's that notion of collage. Think again of cycle novels we've done or Winesburg, Ohio. But some of those individual chapters are terrific little vignettes or short stories. And the wackier, because of the many women that he's involved in. So I think to think of the novel as depicting a shallow hero, but a complicated writer, that is the author, is exactly the way to think of it. A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, which is referenced in this book. This book talks about dozens of writers, scores of writers and dozens of books. It's a very booky book, as it were, partly because Fitzgerald is proud of his own learning and because he's a booky character himself, someone suffused with a love of great literature. In Portrait of an Artist, Stephen Dedalus, as the hero of that book, is nowhere near as rich and laudable as the author who created him. And believe me, Joyce knows it. Joyce is proud of the fact that he writes books that you have to remind yourself, you don't have to remind yourself, you're constantly being reminded is a book. So I appreciate that comment very much. I think that's a key to the way the book works. So to go back to how it's not only a conventional, it's not only not a conventional coming of age novel, it also breaks the pattern of a choice of life. Typically, the choice of a life novel involves the choice of a mate, Rochester or St. John Rivers, Estella or Biddy, Casaubon or Sir James, Angel or Alec. Very clean, very neat. But the roster of females who move through Amory's early years and through his heart, and I can't be the only one who thinks that Amory calls to mind amorous, that roster is much more extensive than merely two. We have Isabel Bourget, we have Clara Page, we have Rosalind Connage, we have Eleanor Savage. And that's leaving aside his early interaction with Myra St. Clair, his first kiss, and his interactions with his mother, Beatrice Blaine. I'm not suggesting incest, but she is sometimes more of a companion to him than a parent. And she does set an influence in his expectation of what a desirable woman should be.
Hey, Mark, let me just interrupt you for a second, because we had a question say, could you comment on the choice of his mother's name? Do you think it's an allusion to the Divine Comedy?
Yeah, I want to say, I think it's very hard not to think that. And I think it mainly has to do with the notion that this is an extraordinary female. It's like if her name were Helen, for Helen of Troy. I don't think I take too much beyond that, except that this is partly a Catholic novel. He was a Catholic writer. As I said, you get married in St. Patrick's Cathedral. Here we are, St. Patrick's Day. How many novels have you read that are part of the classic American canon where an important character is a cleric and a Monsignor who's taken seriously, who's not used satirically? So I do think it's impossible not to feel that there's some element of Dante in that. I will also say, for what it's worth, and the way my mind works, it may tell you more about me than you want to know, that the last three of his four possible lovers, Clara Page, Rosalind Connage, and Eleanor Savage, have names that all end in AGE. That is, they visually rhyme. Page, Connage, Savage, I'm pronouncing them oddly purposely. Savage makes its own point. Connage may be something to do with knowing or connoting. And Page, of course, is a very bookish name. Maybe even Clara Page could be seen as a clear page. I only say this because Fitzgerald, like many writers of the period, was absolutely intoxicated with language. He had a modernist strain, but he was a romantic in his style through and through, luxuriated in language and rhetoric. So Beatrice could well be that. So what accounts for this excess of what might be called the many loves of Amory Blaine? Some of you may remember the old TV show, The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, 1959, I think. The giddy response of the era to the trauma of the First World War in various ways, in the same way that cultural phenomena as jazz and music and collage in the visual arts and in popular culture, flagpole sitting and dance marathons and the petting parties of the 1920s, which the novel touches on. That is, these kind of examples of oddness. We do have to say that from our perspective, we're used to collage, but in its day, people thought it was a very odd thing to rip something up and to put it back together in a different order and glue it out of sequence. Jazz, for many people, when it first came through, seemed barbaric, seemed savage. And of course, flagpole sitting as an oddity and dance marathons as an example of freneticism. I do remember reading one person saying, at least it will get them too tired to have sex. I'm going to bet that didn't happen. And petting parties, these are all examples of, again, I'm using the kind of quaint term wackiness of the 1920s that has underlying it the trauma of the First World War. So this novel, in its form, its various episodes, reflects the restlessness and freneticism that would come to characterize the Jazz Age. Some of you might have heard my lecture at Wharton, not under Michael's convening, but another librarian on Tales of the Jazz Age a couple of years ago. Jazz Age is a phrase that Fitzgerald did not coin, but which he helped to popularize in his writing and in his life with Zelda. So I want to say that underlying all this is the belated reaction to the First World War and what came to be called by cultural critics the New Death. So the final summer and fall of World War I witnessed a faster rate of death among American soldiers than during any other period of American history. After the war, Americans were preoccupied with death as never before. This was partly complicated by the fact that the bodies of their sons and husbands and male family members were over there. They never came back. They couldn't bury them in the field at Gettysburg. They couldn't have a service where their remains were in the same venue that they were. And that made a kind of horror that was new in American culture. The naked intimacy with the fact of death at a distance led to the creation of a term, the New Death, which was used by a religious writer named Winifred Kirkland, who lived from 1872 to 1945, and published an essay about it in 1918. She wrote, "Never before in history has death been so prominent a fact." And of course, we're talking about death by violence. Many Americans in the year that this novel came out were still living in the country and farmlands. People on farms are very familiar with death as a reality all the time. Death of killing animals intentionally, but humanely if they could, and certainly the death by accidents and nature and disease. So again, when the line from the wasteland, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many, I had not thought death had undone so many. That's from Dante, but he's talking about the dead of the First World War. And so in that essay, Kirkland wrote, "No one today can escape the constant presence before his mind of dissolution. No one can forget them. No one can get away from them, those dead boys upon the battlefields of Europe." So I want to suggest to you that that devil man is one of the dead boys on the battlefields of Europe that the novel pushes aside. We know that some of his friends from Princeton have died in the war. We know that he served in the war, escaped death. We know that Fitzgerald escaped service in the war because he served for such a short time and then armistice was declared. And he was terrified that he'd be killed and spent many of his last hours trying to crank out stories so that his name would be recognized even after death. So in a novel that is going to have generational deaths that one would imagine to meet in an initiation story, the death of his father, of his mother, of his spiritual guide and surrogate father, Monsignor Darcy. There are the deaths of Kerry Holiday and Jesse Ferrenby in the war. And most strikingly, the death by automobile accident of Dick Humbird, whose face transforms into the horrific vision Amory has in the New York City apartment in book 1, chapter 3, that devil with the turned up feet. We're told that that vision is unutterably terrible. It's unspeakable. So in trying to give voice to what cannot be expressed, if it's really unspeakable, unutterable, the narrator gives then the example that the scene is like one of those terrible incongruities that shake little things in the back of the brain. What is such an incongruity? Well, a young boy dead. There's an excellent book about a terrible catastrophe of fighting forest fires called Young Men and Fire. And the author of that book says the title comes from two things that should never be combined in the same image: young men and fire, young men and war. And in this novel, when the narrator says it's like one of those terrible incongruities that shake little things in the back of the brain, one of the examples he gives is blood on satin. Blood on satin. That's an extraordinary phrase and goes to the heart of what I want you to take away from my talk about this novel. I should look up sometime. I wonder that there isn't a book somewhere or a song lyric called Blood on Satin. That blood is the blood of the First World War. And the satin is the satin of Gatsby shirts, the satin of conspicuous consumption, the satin that you're going to find in those dormitory rooms in Princeton, the satin that Zelda and Scott had on their wedding night. The novelist knows what he's doing, even if Amory doesn't, which is why the vision has to come through his subconscious or his unconscious rather than explicitly. The control of what the war has done to the culture is within the reins of Fitzgerald, even though Amory might be a unknowing witness to it. That's why he may connect the devil man to Dick, but he doesn't connect Dick to the war. So I want to say that in a number of works of this period, that is the period of the 20s, there is lots of violence, some of which is completely disconnected from the war, apparently, some of which figures in connection to the war. So in Jake Barnes, the protagonist in The Sun Also Rises, 1926, so not long after this novel, he has a war wound that has castrated him. And that wound, of course, is significant to his interactions in the book. In Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, which we'll be doing, the 33-year-old protagonist, or one of the protagonists of that book, was castrated at the age of 16 in 1911 because they were worried that his sexuality would make him attack people. Nobody reading that book in 1929, thinking about a teenager being castrated in 1911, would not have in mind the kinds of maiming that happened in the war. Later, in A Farewell to Arms by Hemingway, the combatant, Lieutenant Frederick Henry, survives his bout of wounds, but his wife dies of a miscarriage, which is described in brutal terms, terms reminiscent of the war wounds suffered by soldiers in the novel. And he loses both her and their baby. He walks out at the end in the rain, just as Amory is in the rain when he can't afford to go indoors in the last chapters of this novel. His wife and his baby are virtual, if not literal, casualties of the First World War. And think about this, how in the Great Gatsby, 1925, Gatsby, a World War I vet, is killed by gunshot, which is not described in detail. But the death of Myrtle Wilson the wife of the man who owns the service station, by Gatsby's automobile, driven by Daisy, in chapter 7 of The Great Gatsby, reads like a war wound. Michaelis and this man reached her first, but when they had torn open her shirtwaist, still damp with perspiration, they saw that her left breast was swinging loose like a flap, and there was no need to listen for the heartbeat beneath. The mouth was wide open and ripped at the corners, as though she had choked a little in giving up the tremendous vitality she had stored so long. So what I'm saying is a scene and description like that, or the castration of Benji in The Sound of the Fury, or the more obvious connections to the war in The Sun Also Rises and Farewell to Arms, it's as if there's an unspoken and possibly unrecognized, even by the people creating it, displacement of the trauma about the war to the experience of writing in the 20s, when for the first time, there seemed to be enough distance from the war that you could write about it. And so in this way, The Great Gatsby is very much a post-World War I novel, and not just in terms of its chronology. Ulysses is very much a post-World War I novel, and not just because of its chronology. And I'll give you a terrific example from A Farewell to Arms, a novel which, if you have never read and you're interested in the modernist novel, especially if you're a fan of Hemingway, or I'll go further and say, if you haven't read it lately, I encourage you to read. It's not a book to go home and have a cozy read by the fire. A Farewell to Arms is a farewell to fighting, but it comes for the person in the book too late. So Lieutenant Henry is fighting in Italy before America is there, and he meets a British nurse, and he's curious about how it is that she's there, since Britain is not in the war yet either. And she says, "Have you done nursing long?" "Since the end of 15, I started when he did." That is, she came to follow her fiance, who's in the war. I said Britain's not in the war, I misspoke. She's come to be a nurse there because her fiance is serving. I remember having a silly idea that he might come to the hospital where I was, with a saber cut, I suppose, and a bandage round his head, or shot through the shoulder, something picaresque. So she came thinking maybe he'd have a wound from a saber cut and have a bandage around his head, like something out of Central Casting, like one of those guys playing the drums or fife, the three Revolutionary War characters, something picturesque. And Lieutenant Henry says, "This is a picturesque front," I said. Yes, people can't realize what France is like. If they did, it couldn't all go on. He didn't have a saber cut. They blew him all to bits. I didn't say anything is the next line. So the reason I read that, and read it poorly, I'm sorry, is that she's come expecting a hallmark moment that he will be politely wounded with a saber cut, because she's thinking of a war like the Crimean War from decades before. And what she finds out is that when he was killed, he was blown to bits, because that's the First World War. That's the modern war. That's the war of mass destruction. That's the war of castration and maiming. And what Lieutenant Henry says is nothing. How much more powerful that she was expecting the picturesque wound, the picturesque interlude, where she could nurse him back to health because all he had was a bandage on his head or a saber cut that could heal. And instead he was blown to bits. That's the shock of the First World War. That's the shock that reverberates through the 20s in so many corners of literature. And we will see it again in the next two novels we read, one more directly, one indirectly. Before I take questions or closing comments, reminding you that I'm available on email, I will say Even Thomas Hardy, the great Victorian novelist who we talked about when we talked about Tess, who had the good fortune to live into the 1920s and see the First World War, which he almost prophesied was coming in his pessimistic view of the universe. One of the last poems he wrote that was published after his death is called Christmas 1924. Remember, he was writing novels in the last decades of the 19th century. He was born during Dickens' lifetime and lived to see the sinking of the Titanic, for example. This is a 4-line poem, Christmas 1924, and for many years, every collection of Hardy's poems had this last, even though it wasn't written last. Peace on earth was said, and we sing it, and pay 1,000,000 priests to ring it. After 2,000 years of mass, we've got as far as poison gas, a weapon of mass destruction. And that rhyme between the Christian mass and the poison gas tells you so much about the period. What I'm suggesting is that awareness of the gas, the bombs that would blow people to bits, they show up in the automobile accidents, in the satin, on the blood on the satin, on the consciousness of sensitive people like Amory, who have been avoiding the war. Remarkable that he's as intelligent and writerly as he is, and yet hardly processes anything about the war he served in the novel that we're reading. It's compartmentalized in an interlude. And you may know that Virginia Woolf, a few years after this novel, published To the Lighthouse, one of her several masterpieces, one of my favorite books of hers, in 1927. And there are 3 parts to that. And the middle part is Time Passes, which is not called an interlude, but is an interlude of the war and what happens to change the family and the characters who've been interacting on this island from the first part, pre-war, to the second part. The period of the 20s is suffused with war consciousness, whether it's explicit or implicit. And it's in this book as well. Michael?
Yeah, Mark, actually, question from a while ago, but it actually segues from what you were just talking about, so it's a good one.
I love a segue.
Yeah, he wrote, I did find it a bit odd that his war experience seemed to be a very minor aspect of Amory's experience of the time. I just felt Amory had such shallow ideals that I found it difficult to accept that he was some representation of people of the time. He certainly is not an everyman.
Yeah. I want to say I share that view. It has occurred to me that his initials might have something to do with his simplicity. He's an A-B kind of guy. It has occurred to me also, this again may tell you more about me than him. His name is one letter removed from Armory. I do think he's somebody who, if you allow for his native intelligence, his ability as a advertising writer, as a poet, his aspirations to be a writer, it's an odd thing that he doesn't make more of his wartime experience. Now you can say the novel is limited to his attempts to find a woman and to find success. But even then, in his exchanges with his friends in Princeton and New York City, in his exchanges with the Monsignor, in his exchanges with his mother, it never comes up in any way that's significant, except in the interlude with the Monsignor. And I think the novel is a testament that it is so traumatic that it's not even a matter where he says, as some men did, and maybe now some women too, don't ask me about that. It's too horrible. I don't want to talk about that. Even that statement is an acknowledgement of the horror, but not to talk about it at all is like a no comment. It's the absence of anything. I'll take one more if you want, Michael.
Sure. And I just want to mention, folks, we did actually get quite a number of comments, so I do encourage you to email Mark, and I can give you his email address. Just shoot me a quick question on that. But here, this is a off the war topic. The comment here is that money seems to be the root of everything in both House of Mirth and This Side of Paradise. I find Lily Bart to be courageous and Amory disappointingly shallow.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to say that that's partly the difference between the novelist, but Edith Wharton is writing in the tradition of the 19th century novel of testing and reflecting character. And this is, again, a wacky book. This is not really a coming of age novel. You may read the novel, as some people do, and I don't mean this, I'm not being patronizing, as him coming to some better understanding of his life. I think he is completely lost, and that when he sees a scene that the narrator channeling Amory sees as having clouds that are bleeding, who in this audience has ever imagined a scene in real life? Remember, this is not a hallucination where you imagine the clouds are bleeding. And if so, please seek medical attention immediately. It is a horrific image of something wispy and white and pure and ephemeral, and then bleeding. It's up there with blood on satin. This is not my fetish. This is not my monomania. The novels of the 20s are filled with this kind of transposed or displaced violence. Now, when we go to In Our Time, and the title, of course, refers to peace in our time. The war is a different war from the First World War, and we'll see there's at least one section on that. I'll just say by way of introduction, there are short stories in that volume, and then there are these interludes, these passages that are not fully fledged stories, that are more like reportage. If you're familiar with The Grapes of Wrath, where there's an alternation between the novel with the Joads and then reportage on what's happening in the country at the time. It's like that, another kind of collage work. So thank you for your patience and participation. I want to say I always welcome belated comments about the book. I want to say I'm not only interested in what you say about me, I am as interested in your reactions to the book. And if you have a mind to share them with me, I will certainly acknowledge my receipt of them. Once again, I want to thank Michael for all his help with me on this, and the Wilton Library, and all of you for attending. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mark. Look, I just want to conclude this with a pair of comments that I think put a nice period on the end of this. One person said, "I never thought of Fitzgerald's words as syncopated jazz. A pretty great and interesting observation in Wilton, Connecticut, the home of Dave Brubeck."
Yeah, amen, brother.
And then another person who, on the musical note, said, "I was just reading that Fitzgerald said Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue was precisely the spirit of the jazz age in music, and I put it on my phone as a quiet accompaniment to this very interesting lecture. I will never listen to it the same way again."
How great is that? And so if I can be allowed one more comment, the great Sid Caesar had a bit on his old show, the Show of Shows, in which he's introducing, he's a jazz bebop artist, and he's introducing the members of his band, and he says who's on bass and who's on piano, and he says, and we have so-and-so on radar. And the interviewer says to him, and it might have been Carl Reiner, "Why do you need a guy on radar?" And he says, "He warns us if we're getting too close to the melody." And if you're a jazz lover, you get the joke. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. God bless Dave Brubeck. Thank you, Michael. Everyone stay well. Spring is coming. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
There you go. Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for attending tonight. And we look forward to next week. We'll see you all next week.